Sometimes life strips away everything you thought defined you, your family, your purpose, the future you planned. Victor Lane knew that emptiness all too well. At a county tax auction, everyone avoided the old convent like it was cursed. The building sat there, covered in ivy and shadows, unwanted and forgotten. The auctioneer called out $3. Victor raised his hand. He bought it for less than the cost of lunch. He thought he was getting a quiet place to disappear and start over. But when he found a bricked-over doorway behind the chapel, everything changed. Hidden beneath the convent was a shelter filled with old journals and letters, proof that the nuns had secretly saved lives during a dark chapter of history. Their courage had been buried and forgotten. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning after the auction, Victor Lane sat in his truck in the parking lot of what was now his property, watching the sun climb over the convent's Gothic spires. 62 years old, and this was what his life had come to, sleeping in a Ford F-150 because he'd bought a building with no heat, no running water, and a reputation that kept everyone else away. He'd paid $3. $3 for 40 rooms, a chapel with stained glass windows, and more square footage than he could calculate without his engineering tools. $3 for a piece of 1890s architecture that should have been on a historic register, but instead sat mouldering at the edge of Millbrook County, avoided by everyone who knew its name. The divorce had been finalized 8 months ago. 35 years of marriage to Diane, gone in a series of signatures, and the division of assets that felt more like an autopsy than a settlement. Victor had taken early retirement from the civil engineering firm where he'd spent 3 decades, partly because the buyout package was generous, mostly because he couldn't stand another day of pretending everything was fine. His son, Preston, had taken his mother's side. Not explicitly, not in words, but in the way he'd stopped calling as often, stopped visiting, stopped asking how Victor was managing. Preston was 32, married, building his own life as a financial advisor in the city. He had no patience for his father's midlife crisis, as he'd called it during their last tense phone conversation. "You bought what?" Preston had asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. "A convent. At auction. For how much?" $3. The silence on the other end had been louder than any argument. Only Iris, his 28-year-old daughter, had tried to understand. She worked as a middle school teacher, had her mother's kindness, but her father's curiosity. When Victor told her about the convent, she'd asked why, really asked, not with judgment, but with genuine interest. "I don't know," he'd admitted. "When everyone else backed away from it, I just felt like it needed someone." "Does that sound crazy?" "No, Dad," she'd said softly. "It sounds like you needed something too." Victor climbed out of the truck, his joints stiff from another night on the bench seat. The morning air was cold, carrying the smell of wet earth and decay. The convent loomed before him, 3 stories of red brick and grey stone, its facade covered in Virginia creeper that had gone wild over the years. Several windows were broken, their glass long since shattered. The main entrance door hung crooked on its hinges. He'd done a preliminary walk-through the day before, right after the auction. The interior was worse than the exterior. Water damage from roof leaks had destroyed plaster in the upper floors. Floorboards were warped and rotted in places. The electrical system was decades out of code. The plumbing was a disaster. But the bones were good. The foundation was solid stone. The main support beams, when he'd tested them, were sound. This building had been constructed to last centuries, built by craftsmen who took pride in their work. Under all the damage and neglect, There was something worth saving. Victor had spent his career assessing structures, determining what could be salvaged and what needed to be demolished. He knew how to read a building, how to see past the surface damage to the integrity beneath. The convent was wounded, but it wasn't dead. He pushed open the main door, which groaned on its rusted hinges. The entrance hall was vast, with a curved staircase leading to the upper floors. Dust motes danced in the pale sunlight that filtered through the broken windows. The air smelled of mold and old wood, and something else, something he couldn't quite identify. Not unpleasant, just old. The smell of time itself. His footsteps echoed as he walked. He'd brought a notebook this morning, planning to make a proper assessment, to list every repair that needed doing, to calculate costs and timelines. It was what he did, what he'd always done. Turn chaos into ordered plans, transform problems into solutions. But as he walked through the corridors, something else happened. He felt something he hadn't felt in months, maybe years. He felt interested, engaged, awake. The auction coordinator, Lloyd Mackey, had given him a brief history the day before. The convent had been built in 1892 by the Sisters of Divine Mercy. It had operated continuously until 1962, when it had closed suddenly. Lloyd hadn't known why, just that one day the nuns were there, and the next day they were gone. Place has been empty ever since, Lloyd had said, his weathered face thoughtful. County took it for back taxes in the 70s. Been trying to sell it ever since. Nobody wants it. Why not? Victor had asked. Lloyd had shrugged, but there was something in his expression. Something uneasy. People say things. You know how it is. Bad energy, they say. Sounds at night. Folks who've gone inside say it feels wrong somehow. You believe that? I believe some places hold on to their secrets for a reason, Lloyd had said. You be careful in there, Mr. Lane. Victor didn't believe in ghosts or bad energy. He believed in structural damage and acoustic anomalies, and the way old buildings settled and creaked. But he couldn't deny that the convent had an atmosphere, a weight to it that he felt as he explored. He made his way to the chapel, located in the east wing. The double doors stood open, and he stepped inside, his breath catching despite himself. It was beautiful. The damage was here too. Water stains on the walls, crumbling plaster, broken pews. But the space itself was breathtaking. High vaulted ceilings with exposed beams, tall windows that would have flooded the room with colored light when the stained glass was intact. An altar at the far end, simple but elegant, carved from dark wood. And behind the altar, a statue of Mary, life-sized, carved from white marble. She stood in an alcove, her hands outstretched, her face serene. Someone had cared for her. There was less dust on the statue than anywhere else in the chapel, as if even time itself had treated her gently. Victor approached slowly, his engineer's eye noting the craftsmanship. The statue was mounted on a stone pedestal, integrated into the wall itself. The detail work was extraordinary. Every fold of her robes, every finger, carved with precision and love. As he stood there, he noticed something hanging on a nail beside the alcove. A rosary. Not plastic or metal, but carved from wood, each bead smooth and worn from use. He lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of it in his palm. His grandmother had been named Agnes. She'd died when Victor was 15, but he remembered her rosary, how she'd held it every evening, her lips moving in silent prayer. He remembered her hands, weathered and strong, hands that had baked bread and mended clothes and held him when he was small. He hadn't thought about her in years. Victor hung the rosary back on the nail, a strange ache in his chest. This building had been someone's home. These rooms had held lives, routines, prayers and purposes. What had happened to the women who'd lived here? Where had they gone? He spent the rest of the morning exploring, making notes. The convent had been abandoned in layers. He could see evidence of different eras. Some rooms looked like they'd been left in the 1960s, personal items still on shelves. Other areas had clearly been occupied later, perhaps by squatters or vandals, with newer graffiti and trash from the 1970s and 1980s. But the chapel seemed untouched, as if even those who'd broken in and caused damage elsewhere had respected this space. By noon, Victor's notebook was full of observations. He needed help. This was too much work for one person. He needed tools, materials, probably permits, though he suspected the county would be thrilled someone was finally doing something with the property. His phone buzzed, a text from Preston. "Mum says you're living in that building now. Seriously?" Victor typed back, "Staying here temporarily. It's not as bad as it sounds." The response came quickly. "It sounds terrible. You're 62, Dad. You should be enjoying retirement, not playing contractor with a condemned building." "It's not condemned." "It should be." Victor put his phone away without responding further. Preston wouldn't understand. How could he explain that for the first time, since the divorce, since the retirement, since his whole life had fallen apart? He felt like he had a reason to get up in the morning. That evening, as the sun set and the convent filled with shadows, Victor heard them. The sounds Lloyd had mentioned. Creaking, settling, the whisper of wind through broken windows. Footsteps that were probably his own, echoing back to him through empty corridors. He wasn't afraid. He'd spent enough time in old buildings to know they all made noise, especially at night when temperature changes made materials contract and expand. But lying in his sleeping bag on the chapel floor, he'd chosen it because it was the driest, most intact room. He couldn't help but wonder. Who had knelt at that altar? Who had prayed before that statue? What had they prayed for? The rosary hung in the darkness, barely visible in the moonlight through the broken windows. In the morning, he would start making calls, finding help, beginning the real work of restoration. But tonight, in the silence and the shadows, Victor Lane felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. 2 weeks into the work, Victor hired Gus Pemberton. Gus was in his 70s, a local handyman who still took small jobs around Millbrook County. He showed up in a pickup truck even older than Victor's, with a toolbox that looked like it had survived 2 world wars. His handshake was firm, his eyes sharp beneath thick grey eyebrows. "Heard you bought the old convent," Gus said, looking up at the building with an expression Victor couldn't quite read. "People said you were crazy." "People are probably right," Victor replied. "You willing to work on a crazy man's project?" Gus was quiet for a moment, still studying the building. "I knew this place when I was a boy. Used to deliver groceries here with my uncle. The nuns were kind. Always gave us cookies." He paused. "They were good women. Private, but good. What happened to them? Don't rightly know. One day they were here, next day they weren't. My grandmother worked here as a cook for a while, back in the late 50s. She left sudden-like in 62, same time as the nuns disappeared. Never would talk about it after." "Why not?" Gus shook his head. Always seemed scared when anyone asked. Took whatever happened here to her grave. He turned to Victor. "But I'll help you. This place deserves better than rotting away to nothing." They started with the roof, stopping the leaks, before they could cause more damage. Then the windows, boarding up the broken ones temporarily. Victor's engineering background proved invaluable. He could assess load-bearing walls, identify structural problems, plan the work in logical sequences. Gus was slower, but thorough, a man who'd spent 60 years learning his trade through experience rather than textbooks. They worked well together, falling into an easy rhythm of shared labor and comfortable silence. It was during the third week, while working in the chapel, that Victor noticed something odd. They were removing damaged plaster from the walls, preparing to repair the water damage. Victor was working behind the altar, near the statue of Mary, when his trowel hit something that sounded different. He stopped, tapped the wall again. Hollow. "Gus, come listen to this." Gus set down his tools and came over. Victor tapped different sections of the wall. Most sounded solid, the trowel striking brick or stone, but one section, about 4 feet wide and 7 feet tall, sounded distinctly hollow. "That's strange," Gus said, frowning. "Could be just a cavity in the wall, but—" He ran his hand over the plaster. "This section's newer, different texture. See how the paint here doesn't quite match?" Victor stepped back, examining the wall with fresh eyes. Gus was right. The paint on this section was slightly different, the plaster smoother, less weathered. It had been repaired or replaced more recently than the surrounding wall. Why would someone repair just this section? Victor wondered aloud. Maybe there was damage. Water leak. Could be. But that didn't make sense. This section of wall was interior, not near any windows or roof areas where water would intrude. Victor grabbed a flashlight and examined the edges more carefully. Where the newer plaster met the old, there was a distinct seam, almost perfectly rectangular. "This isn't a repair," Victor said slowly. "This is covering something." Gus went very quiet beside him. When Victor looked at him, the old man's face had gone pale. "Maybe we should leave it be," Gus said softly. "Why?" "Some things are covered up for a reason." "Gus, what do you know about this?" "Nothing. I don't know nothing." But Gus wouldn't meet his eyes. "I just think maybe we shouldn't go poking around where we weren't invited." Victor studied his new friend. Gus was genuinely frightened, and that was more unsettling than anything else. But Victor had spent his entire career solving problems, investigating anomalies, finding explanations for the unexplained. He couldn't just leave this alone. "I need to see what's behind this wall," Victor said. "You don't have to help, but I'm going to look." Gus was silent for a long moment. Finally he sighed. "Your property, your choice. But I'm telling you, Mr. Lane, some secrets stay buried for good reasons." Despite his words, Gus didn't leave. He stood nearby, tools in hand, while Victor carefully began removing plaster from the mysterious section of wall. The plaster came away easily, revealing what lay beneath. Bricks. Not the old, weathered bricks of the original construction, but newer ones, mismatched in color and size. Victor examined them closely, using his engineering knowledge to date them. The manufacturing stamps were visible on some. These were from the 1960s, maybe early 1970s. Someone had built a wall here, deliberately, and then plastered over it to hide it. "There's a doorway behind this," Victor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone bricked up a doorway." "Christ almighty," Gus muttered. "Please, Victor, leave it alone." But Victor couldn't. His hands were already reaching for the pry bar, positioning it between bricks, applying pressure. The mortar was old, not professionally done. The bricks began to come loose, one at a time. Behind them, darkness. The smell hit him first. Cold air, damp earth, old paper. The smell of a space that had been sealed for decades. Victor pulled away more bricks, his heart pounding, until he'd created an opening large enough to shine his flashlight through. Stone steps leading down into darkness. "There's a staircase," Victor said, his voice shaking. "Going down. Underground." Gus came closer, despite his fear. and looked through the opening. His face went even paler. Sweet Jesus, I never knew this was here. Victor pulled away more bricks, widening the opening until he could fit through. Every instinct told him to be careful, to proceed slowly, to think about structural safety and air quality and a dozen other practical concerns. But he was already stepping through, already descending into the darkness. The stairs were steep, the ceiling low. Victor had to duck his head as he went down, counting steps. 15, 16, 17. The air grew colder with each step. But it wasn't stale. There was ventilation from somewhere, fresh air mixing with the smell of old stone and earth. At the bottom, his flashlight beam swept across a large underground chamber. Victor stopped breathing. The room was perhaps 30 feet square, with reinforced walls and a surprisingly high ceiling. Along one wall stood metal filing cabinets. Along another, wooden crates stacked neatly. Shelves held supplies, boxes, containers, all covered in dust but remarkably well preserved. In the center of the room sat a simple wooden table and 4 chairs, as if someone had just stepped away from a meeting. And everywhere, there were papers, documents in files, notebooks stacked on shelves, journals lying open on the table. Victor walked forward slowly, his flashlight beam catching words on the open journal. The handwriting was neat, feminine, precise. April 12th, 1956. We have made our choice. God forgive us if we are wrong. But we cannot stand by and do nothing. The first family arrives tonight. Sister Catherine has prepared the medical supplies. Sister Beatrice has finished the documents. We are ready. We are terrified. But we are ready. Victor's hands were shaking as he picked up the journal. He flipped back to the first page. The name written there, in the same neat hand. Sister Agnes. Behind him, he heard Gus descending the stairs, slow and reluctant. The old man reached the bottom and stood in silence, staring at the room. What is this place? Victor whispered. Gus's voice was hoarse. It's what my grandmother was afraid of. It's what they kept secret. He pointed at the shelves, the supplies, the carefully organized chaos of documents. This is where they hid people. Victor turned to look at him. What? The nuns. They were hiding people. Down here, under the chapel, where no one would think to look. Gus's eyes were wide. My God, all these years and nobody knew. Victor looked around the room again, seeing it with new understanding. This wasn't just storage. This was a shelter, a sanctuary, a place built to keep people safe and hidden. The medical supplies on the shelves, bandages, medicines, all carefully labeled. The crates, he opened one, finding canned goods, preserved food, enough to feed people for weeks. The filing cabinets, he pulled open a drawer, finding folders full of documents, photographs, names, dates. This had been an operation. Organized, systematic, maintained for years. Victor picked up another journal, flipped through pages of entries, names of people who'd come through, dates they'd arrived and departed, notes about their conditions, their needs, where they'd gone next. Sister Agnes had documented everything. How many people? Victor asked, his voice echoing in the chamber. Gus shook his head, overwhelmed. I don't know. Dozens, maybe. Could be more. Victor returned to the first journal, to Sister Agnes's first entry. His flashlight beam illuminated the words written 69 years ago. We have made our choice. What choice had they made? Who were they hiding? And why had this place been sealed away, buried beneath bricks and plaster, erased from memory? Victor looked up at Gus, and in the old man's frightened eyes, he saw the reflection of his own wonder and shock. This wasn't just a building he'd bought for $3. This was history. This was courage. This was a secret that had waited nearly 7 decades to be discovered. And Victor Lane, lost and directionless and searching for purpose, had found it. Victor didn't leave the shelter for 3 days. He brought down a camping chair, a thermos of coffee, and his reading glasses. He positioned a battery-powered lantern on the table and began reading Sister Agnes's journals from the beginning, page by page, entry by entry. Gus came and went, working upstairs on the convent repairs, but he refused to spend time in the shelter. "That's your ghost to wrestle with," he said. "I'll handle the living world up here." The journals painted a picture Victor could hardly believe. In 1956, the region had been in turmoil. Political upheaval, government crackdowns on dissidents, families disappearing in the night. It was a period historians called the quiet years. Quiet because so much had been suppressed, hidden, erased from official records. Sister Agnes wrote about refugees arriving at the convent gates, desperate and terrified, families fleeing persecution, political activists hunted by authorities, teachers, journalists, union organizers, people whose only crime was speaking truth or demanding justice. The church hierarchy had officially forbidden involvement. Too dangerous, they said. Too political. The convents were to remain neutral, to keep their heads down, to pray, but not act. Sister Agnes and her fellow nuns had chosen differently. May 3rd, 1956. Tonight we welcomed the Kowalski family, husband, wife, 3 children under 10. They walked for 2 days to reach us. The youngest child has a fever. Sister Catherine is treating her now. They will stay until we can arrange safe passage north. Father Kay has promised to help with documents. Victor's engineering mind mapped the operation as he read. The shelter could house perhaps 20 people comfortably. The ventilation system was ingenious. Disguised vents led to the old convent chimney system, providing fresh air without visible openings. Sound insulation had been added to the walls, probably taken from old mattresses and furniture. Someone had planned this carefully. Someone had understood both construction and the need for absolute secrecy. As he read deeper into the journals, Victor found his answer. Sister Beatrice, before taking her vows, had studied architecture. Sister Catherine had been a trained nurse. Sister Margaret had worked in government offices and understood bureaucracy. Each nun brought skills that made the operation possible. But it was Sister Agnes who held it all together. Her entries revealed a woman of fierce intelligence and deeper compassion. She wrestled with doubt. Are we right to disobey our superiors? But always came back to the same conclusion. How can we call ourselves servants of God if we turn away those in need? Victor found himself crying as he read about a child born in the shelter during a snowstorm in January 1959. Sister Catherine had delivered the baby with only candlelight and prayer. Mother and child both survived. They named the baby Agnes in honor of the sister who'd given them sanctuary. Where were they now? That child would be 66 years old. Did she know where she'd been born? Did she know about the women who'd saved her mother's life? On the 3rd day, Iris came to visit. Victor heard her calling his name upstairs, heard Gus directing her to the chapel. He climbed the stairs, blinking in the bright afternoon light. "Dad?" Iris stood in the chapel, concern etched on her face. "Gus says you've been down there for days. Are you okay?" Victor looked at his daughter, really looked at her. She had his late mother's eyes, kind and searching. She'd driven 3 hours to check on him because she cared. Because even when everyone else thought he was losing his mind, she tried to understand. "Come with me," he said quietly. "I need to show you something." He led her down the stone steps into the shelter. Iris gasped when she saw the room, her hand flying to her mouth. Victor handed her one of the journals, watched as she opened it, and began to read. 20 minutes later, she was crying. "They saved all these people," she whispered. "Dad, they saved all these people. At least 47, based on what I've read so far. Maybe more." Iris wiped her eyes, looking around the shelter with wonder. "Why doesn't anyone know about this?" "I don't know yet. The journals stop in early 1962. Something happened then, something that made them seal this place up." Victor picked up another journal, showed her the final entries. They were rushed, frightened. The last few entries are brief, almost frantic. Iris sat down at the table, still holding the journal. "What are you going to do?" "Keep reading. Try to understand what happened. Find out where these people went, if any of them are still alive." Victor paused. "These nuns gave everything for strangers. The least I can do is make sure their story isn't forgotten." His daughter looked at him with something like pride. "You sound different, Dad. You sound like yourself again." "I didn't realize I'd lost myself until I found this place." They spent the afternoon together in the shelter, Iris reading journals while Victor examined the filing cabinets more carefully. Inside, he found detailed supply manifests, evidence of how the nuns had hidden their true activities. Food deliveries marked as convent supplies that were far too large for 9 women. Medical supplies ordered through a sympathetic doctor. Everything carefully documented, everything with plausible cover stories. These women had been brilliant. They'd run an underground railroad under everyone's noses for 6 years. In one cabinet, Victor found a metal box. Inside were identification papers, photographs, documents, all carefully preserved in oilcloth. "Iris, look at this." His daughter came over as he spread the documents on the table. Passports, identity cards, travel papers, all of them forgeries. Beautiful, meticulous forgeries that looked completely authentic. "Sister Beatrice," Victor said, remembering a journal entry. "She studied art before becoming a nun. She created these." Iris picked up one of the passports, examining the detail work. "These are incredible. You'd never know they weren't real." Victor found a photograph among the papers, a family of 4, formal portrait. On the back, in Sister Agnes's handwriting, the Kovac family, departed March 1960. May God protect them on their journey. He stared at the faces. Mother, father, 2 children who couldn't have been more than 7 or 9. They looked serious in the way people do in passport photos. But there was hope in their eyes. Hope because 9 nuns in a forgotten convent had given them new identities and a chance at freedom. "Where are they now?" Iris wondered aloud. "I'm going to find out." Victor carefully returned the documents to their box. "I'm going to find as many of them as I can, or their children, their grandchildren. Someone needs to know what these women did." Preston called that evening, his voice tight with frustration. "Iris says you found something in the building. Some kind of hidden room. A shelter, underground. The nuns were hiding refugees in the 1950s and 60s. Silence on the line. Then, "Dad, you can't seriously be getting obsessed with this." "I'm not obsessed. You're neglecting everything else. Your bills are piling up. You haven't returned calls from the insurance company. You're living in a ruin and digging through old papers like it's some kind of treasure hunt." Victor felt his temper rising. "These aren't just old papers, Preston. These are records of real people who were saved by extraordinary women. This matters. It matters more than your own life, more than your family." "My family hasn't seemed very interested in my life lately." The silence that followed was cold. Finally, Preston said, "You know what? Do whatever you want. You always do anyway." The line went dead. Victor stood in the chapel, phone in hand, feeling the familiar ache of estrangement from his son. But beneath the ache was something else. Conviction. Preston didn't understand, because he'd never felt purposeless, never felt the emptiness of waking up with nothing to care about. These journals, this shelter, this story. It mattered. Victor knew it in his bones, the way he'd once known which buildings could be saved and which were beyond redemption. The nuns had risked everything for people they didn't know. The least Victor could do was risk a little family tension to make sure their courage was remembered. He returned to the shelter, to the journals, to the voices of women who'd been dead for decades, but whose words still rang with truth and purpose. Sister Agnes wrote, "Faith without works is dead. We choose works." Victor chose the same. Victor established a routine over the following weeks. Mornings in the shelter, reading and documenting. Afternoons working with Gus on the building repairs. Evenings researching, making notes, trying to piece together the larger story. He'd created a timeline on the chapel wall using masking tape and index cards. Each card represented a person or family who'd passed through the shelter, with whatever details the journals provided. The timeline stretched from May 1956 to February 1962, nearly 6 years of continuous operation. By his count, at least 63 people had been sheltered, probably more, given the gaps in the records. One afternoon, while organizing documents from the filing cabinets, Victor found something that stopped him cold. A photograph. 9 nuns standing in front of the convent, formal and solemn in their habits. The photo was dated 1955, the year before the shelter operation began. Sister Agnes stood in the center, a woman who looked to be in her 40s, with a face that managed to be both stern and kind. The other nuns surrounded her, younger and older, all with that same look of quiet dignity. But one face had been scratched out. Violently. Someone had taken something sharp and scraped across the photograph, obliterating the features of the nun standing at the far right. Victor turned the photo over. On the back, in faded ink, were the names Agnes, Catherine, Beatrice, Teresa, Dorothy, Margaret, Ruth, Florence, and one name scratched out as thoroughly as the face. Who was the 9th nun? And why had someone tried to erase her? He took the photograph upstairs to show Gus, who was replacing floorboards in the entrance hall. The old man studied it carefully, his expression troubled. "Florence," Gus said quietly. "My grandmother mentioned that name once. Said it with bitterness, like the name itself tasted bad. What happened to her? Don't know. Grandmother wouldn't say more than that. Just, Florence broke faith. That's all she ever said." Victor stared at the ruined face in the photograph. Someone had loved these nuns enough to scratch out a betrayer. Someone had cared deeply about what happened here. He needed to find more answers, and the journals could only tell him so much. Victor decided to visit the local library. The Millbrook County Library was a small brick building downtown, run by Mrs. Constance Whitmore, a woman in her late 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and an encyclopedic knowledge of local history. "The old convent?" she said, when Victor explained what he was researching. "My goodness, that takes me back. I was just a girl when it closed, but I remember. Everyone talked about it." "What did they say?" Constance led him to the local history section, pulling out old newspaper archives. It happened so suddenly. The nuns were there one day, gone the next. No explanation, no farewell. The building just sat empty. She spread out newspapers from 1962. Victor scanned the pages eagerly, but found almost nothing. One small article, dated February 20th, 1962. Local convent closes. Sisters of Divine Mercy relocate after 70 years of service. That was it. No details, no explanation. Just those 2 sentences. That's all? Victor asked, disappointed. That's all that was printed. But people talked. Constance lowered her voice, even though they were alone. There were rumors. Some said the church had found financial impropriety. Others said there'd been a scandal. My mother told me she'd heard the nuns had done something that angered the bishop, but she never knew what. Victor showed her the photograph. Do you recognize any of these women? Constance studied it carefully. Sister Agnes, yes. She was the Mother Superior. Very respected. And Sister Catherine, she had nursing training, helped people in town sometimes. She pointed to others. Sister Beatrice, she did beautiful artwork for the church. Sister Margaret, she managed the convent's business affairs. What about this one? Victor indicated the scratched-out face. Constance frowned. That would have been Sister Florence, I think. She was younger than the others, joined the order later. I don't remember much about her. Victor spent the rest of the afternoon in the library, searching for any mention of the quiet years, the period Sister Agnes had referenced. He found scattered articles about political tensions, labor disputes, mysterious disappearances. Nothing explicit, nothing official, just hints and implications that something dark had been happening in the region. A pattern emerged. Certain families had vanished suddenly. Political activists had relocated without explanation. Union organizers had moved away overnight. And always, the official records showed nothing unusual, just people exercising their freedom to leave. But between the lines, Victor could read the truth. These people had been fleeing something. The nuns had been helping them escape. That evening, back at the convent, Victor received an email from Phyllis Kincaid, the genealogy researcher he'd hired to trace the refugee families. She'd found something. Mr. Lane, I've located descendants of 3 families from your list. Most promising is Harold Zimmerman. His grandparents match the description of Zimmerman family, arrived June 1957 from the journal entries. Harold lives about 2 hours from you. I've taken the liberty of reaching out to him. He's very interested in speaking with you. Victor's hands shook as he typed a response to the email address Phyllis had provided. He introduced himself, explained the discovery, asked if Harold would be willing to visit the convent. The response came within an hour. Mr. Lane, I can't believe what you've found. My grandparents died years ago, but they told us stories about being saved by angels in habits during a dark time. We never knew details. They were too frightened to say more. I thought their story was lost forever. I can come this weekend if that works for you. Thank you for finding this. Thank you for caring. Harold. Victor read the email 3 times, emotion swelling in his chest. These weren't just historical records. These were real lives, real families, real people whose existence had been shaped by what happened in the shelter beneath his feet. On Saturday, Harold Zimmerman arrived. He was 52, a high school teacher with kind eyes and his grandfather's nose. Victor could see the resemblance in the photograph from the files. Victor led him down into the shelter. Harold stopped at the bottom of the stairs, overwhelmed. He touched the walls, the table, the shelves where medical supplies still sat. They were here, he whispered. My grandparents were actually here. Victor showed him the journal entries about the Zimmerman family. Harold read them with tears streaming down his face. My grandmother had pneumonia when they arrived. It says here Sister Catherine treated her for 3 weeks. Harold looked up. She recovered. She lived another 45 years. She raised 4 children, had 9 grandchildren, all because of these women. They sat together at the table where the nuns had once planned their dangerous work. Harold shared what he knew. His grandparents had escaped to Canada, rebuilt their lives, never spoke in detail about their flight, but always referenced the nuns with reverence and gratitude. "My grandfather died last year," Harold said. "He left a letter to be opened after his death. Wait, I brought it." He pulled an envelope from his jacket. Inside was a single page, written in shaky handwriting. "To whoever might care, I owe everything to 9 women whose names I never learned. They risked their lives to save strangers. They hid us, healed us, gave us new papers and new hope. I pray someone remembers them. I pray their courage isn't forgotten. Everything I became, everyone I loved, every moment of joy I experienced, all of it exists because they chose mercy over safety. God bless them, wherever they are." Harold's voice broke on the final words. Victor felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about preserving history. This was about honoring a debt that spanned generations. "Your grandfather's prayer is being answered," Victor said quietly. "Someone does remember, and their courage won't be forgotten. I promise you that." As Harold left that evening, Victor stood in the shelter, surrounded by the evidence of extraordinary courage. He thought about Sister Agnes, Sister Catherine, Sister Beatrice, and the others. He thought about the risks they'd taken, the sacrifices they'd made, and he understood finally what his own life had been missing. Purpose isn't found. It's chosen. Just as the nuns had chosen mercy over safety, Victor was choosing remembrance over comfort. Whatever it cost him, he would tell this story. The discovery of Sister Catherine's medical log changed everything. Victor found it wedged behind one of the filing cabinets, a leather-bound notebook with pages brittle from age. The entries were clinical, precise, written in the steady hand of someone trained to document under pressure. June 15th, 1958. Patient, male, approximately 35, gunshot wound to left shoulder. Bullet passed through, no bone damage. Cleaned and sutured wound. Administered penicillin. Patient stable. October 3rd, 1959. Patient, female, late 20s. Severe malnutrition and dehydration. 3 days of IV fluids and broth. Patient improving. December 12th, 1959. Emergency delivery. Breech presentation. Mother exhausted from journey. Baby boy delivered after 4 hours of labor. Mother and child both stable. Child named Agnes, in honor of our Mother Superior. Victor sat reading the log, his throat tight. Sister Catherine hadn't just offered sanctuary. She'd performed surgery in this underground room. She'd delivered babies. She'd saved lives with nothing but basic supplies and determination. The scope of what these women had done was staggering. He made a decision. It was time to bring in an expert, someone who could help him understand the historical significance of what he'd found. Iris had a colleague at the university, a historian named Dr. Eugene Faber, who specialized in resistance movements and hidden histories. Eugene arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and the excited energy of someone who'd spent his life chasing stories buried in archives. He descended into the shelter and immediately understood what he was seeing. "My God," he breathed, touching the medical supplies with reverent fingers. "This is extraordinary. This is a complete, documented underground operation. Do you understand how rare this is?" "I'm beginning to," Victor said. Eugene spent hours examining everything: journals, medical logs, forged documents, supply manifests. He photographed pages, made detailed notes, asked Victor 100 questions. "This needs to be preserved," Eugene finally said. "Properly archived, researched, published. This is significant history, Mr. Lane. The nuns who did this deserve to be remembered. The people they saved deserve to have their stories told. But Victor hesitated. What about their privacy? Sister Agnes kept these records hidden for a reason. She kept them hidden because it was dangerous then. It's not dangerous now. It's history. And history that isn't told is history that's lost. Eugene looked at him seriously. These women performed acts of extraordinary courage. Don't you think they deserve to be honored for that? The question haunted Victor for days. He understood Eugene's point, but something made him protective of the nuns' secrets. They'd chosen anonymity, chosen to work in darkness. Did he have the right to drag their story into light? Then Preston showed up unannounced. Victor was in the shelter when he heard footsteps on the stairs. His son appeared at the bottom, looking uncomfortable and out of place in his business suit and polished shoes. "So this is what you've been obsessing over," Preston said, looking around the room with obvious skepticism. "It's not an obsession. It's important." "Important to who, Dad? To you? Because it seems like you've forgotten about everything else. Your bills are overdue. You're living in a building with no heat. You haven't answered my calls in 2 weeks. I've been busy. Busy with dead people's secrets." Preston picked up one of the journals, flipped through it dismissively. "This is just old paper. These nuns are gone. The people they helped are probably gone, too. What difference does any of this make?" Victor felt anger rising, hot and sudden. "It makes a difference because these women risked everything to save lives. Because courage like that deserves to be remembered. Because what? Because you need something to care about since Mum left. Because you need to feel like your life has meaning?" Preston's voice was sharp. "Dad, you're 62 years old. You should be enjoying retirement, spending time with your grandkids, not living like a hermit in a ruin, chasing ghosts." "I don't have grandkids," Victor said quietly. "You haven't let me see them since the divorce." Preston's face flushed. "That's not fair. You know things have been complicated." "What I know is that my son stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as an embarrassment." They stood in the cold shelter, years of unspoken resentment suddenly filling the air between them. Preston looked away first. "I came here to convince you to stop this, to come back to reality. But I can see you're too far gone." He headed for the stairs, then stopped. "When this all falls apart, when you've wasted all your money and time on this pointless project, don't expect me to fix it for you." He left. Victor stood alone in the shelter, hand shaking, heart pounding. But beneath the hurt, beneath the anger, he felt something else. Certainty. Preston was wrong. This wasn't pointless. This mattered more than anything Victor had done in years. He returned to the journals, seeking comfort in Sister Agnes's words, and found an entry that spoke directly to him across the decades. September 8th, 1960. "Tonight I wonder if we are fools. The danger grows daily. Sister Florence questions our mission openly now. Father K warns that authorities are becoming suspicious. The Church threatens us with excommunication. Everyone tells us to stop, to be sensible, to think of ourselves. But how can we turn away those who knock at our gate? How can we call ourselves faithful if we choose safety over mercy? Some will say we are wrong. Perhaps we are. But I would rather be wrong while trying to save lives than right while watching people die." Victor read the passage 3 times. Sister Agnes had faced the same doubts, the same pressure from loved ones, the same accusations of foolishness. She'd chosen courage anyway. The next day, Iris brought Dr. Eugene Faber back to the convent, along with another visitor. Harold Zimmerman had returned, this time with someone else. "Mr. Lane, this is my cousin, Barbara," Harold said. "Her mother was that baby born in the shelter. The one they named Agnes." Barbara was a woman in her mid-60s with warm eyes and her mother's grateful smile. She wept when Victor showed her sister Catherine's medical log, the entry describing her own birth. "My mother died 10 years ago," Barbara said. She always knew she'd been born in unusual circumstances, but never knew the details. She would have wanted to thank these women. Since I can't do that, I'd like to help tell their story. Between Harold, Barbara, and Eugene, a plan began to form. They would research, document, and preserve everything. They would find more descendants of the refugees if possible. They would create a proper historical record. And they would make sure the world knew what 9 nuns had done in this hidden shelter beneath a forgotten convent. Victor felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This was bigger than him now. This was bigger than his strained relationship with Preston, bigger than his divorce, bigger than whatever remained of his old life. This was legacy. This was meaning. This was exactly what he'd been searching for, without knowing it. That night, alone in the shelter, Victor made a promise to Sister Agnes and her fellow nuns. "I'll tell your story. I'll make sure you're remembered. I'll honor what you did." He placed his hand on the worn pages of her journal, feeling the texture of paper that had survived 60 years of darkness, waiting for someone to find it, waiting for someone to care. Victor cared, and he wouldn't let them be forgotten. Victor spent the next week examining every document in the filing cabinets. He worked methodically, cataloguing each item, cross-referencing names and dates with the journals. What emerged was a picture of an operation far more sophisticated than he'd imagined. In the back of one drawer, he found a metal box sealed with wax. The seal had cracked with age, but the contents were perfectly preserved inside layers of oilcloth. Identity papers, dozens of them. He spread them carefully on the table. Passports, birth certificates, work permits, travel documents, all forgeries, all exquisitely done. Each one looked completely authentic, down to the watermarks and official stamps. One set caught his attention. The Kovac family, parents and 2 children, ages 7 and 9 in the photographs. Their original documents showed their real names, their real history as political dissidents wanted by the government. The forged papers gave them new identities. The merchant family, relocating for work opportunities. The attention to detail was remarkable. Sister Beatrice had created entire life histories for these people. Employment records, school transcripts, references from fictional employers. If anyone had checked, the documents would have held up to scrutiny. Victor thought about the risk. If the nuns had been caught with these forgeries, they wouldn't have faced just excommunication. They would have faced prison, possibly execution, for aiding enemies of the state. They'd done it anyway. He photographed the Kovac documents and sent them to Phyllis Kincaid, his genealogy researcher. Within 2 days, she had news. "Mr. Lane, I found them. The Kovac family made it to Canada under their false identity. They eventually reclaimed their real name once they were safe. Both children are still alive. The daughter, Anna, is 72 and lives in Toronto. The son, Peter, is 70 and lives in Vancouver. I've contacted Anna. She wants to talk to you." The phone call with Anna Kovac was one Victor would never forget. "My parents never told us the full story," she said, her voice thick with emotion and a faint accent. "They said only that angels saved us, women in black who gave us new names and new life. I was 7 years old. I remember the shelter, the cold stone walls, the kind sister who gave me soup, the one who drew pictures to make me smile. Sister Beatrice, Victor said. She was an artist. Yes. Yes, I remember now. She drew a bird for me, a beautiful bird flying free. She said that's what I would be, free as a bird. Anna's voice broke. Mr. Lane, my parents died believing their story would be lost, that no one would ever know about the women who saved us. You've given us back our history. I'd like you to come visit, Victor said. See the place where you stayed. Read the journal entries about your family. I'll come, Anna said immediately. And I'll bring my children and grandchildren. They need to see this. They need to understand where they came from. While Victor waited for Anna's visit, Eugene returned with a university colleague, a documentary filmmaker interested in the story. But Victor wasn't ready for that yet. Something still bothered him. Some missing piece he couldn't quite identify. He returned to the journals, reading more carefully this time, paying attention not just to what was written, but to what wasn't. And he noticed something odd. The entries about Sister Florence grew increasingly strained. At first, she was mentioned regularly. Sister Florence helped with supply inventory. Sister Florence assisted with document preparation. But starting in mid-1961, the mentions changed. Sister Florence expressed concern about the risk we're taking. Sister Florence questioned whether we have the authority to do this work. Sister Florence has withdrawn from active participation. She spends much time in private prayer. Then, in January 1962, a single line. Sister Florence has betrayed our trust. Nothing more, no details, no explanation. Just that one devastating sentence. Victor returned to the photograph, to the scratched-out face. Sister Florence had been part of their community, part of their mission. What had happened to turn her against them? He shared his observation with Gus, who was installing new electrical wiring in the upper floors. Fear, Gus said simply. Fear makes people do terrible things. My grandmother used to say that. She'd say, Gus, you can forgive a lot in this world, but fear is the hardest thing to forgive because it makes good people do bad things. You think Florence was afraid? I think she was part of something dangerous, and eventually that danger became too real. She probably thought she was doing the right thing, protecting the church, protecting herself. Gus shook his head. But she destroyed what they'd built. That's what fear does. The week before Anna Kovach's planned visit, Victor received an unexpected package. No return address, just a postmark from a small town in Oregon. Inside was a letter and another photograph. The letter was typed, brief. Mr. Lane, I heard about your discovery through the Historical Society network. My aunt was Sister Agnes. She died in 1978, but she left something with my mother before she died. Mother said to give it to anyone who ever found the shelter. I think that's you. The photo is from 1962, taken the day before they sealed the shelter. Look at their faces. They knew what they were losing. A friend of the truth. The photograph showed the 9 nuns standing in the shelter. It must have been taken with a timer. All 9 were in frame, no one behind the camera. They looked exhausted, sad, determined. Sister Agnes stood in the center, holding what looked like the leather portfolio Victor had found under the Mary statue, and Sister Florence stood at the edge, separate from the others, her face turned slightly away. Even in the grainy photograph, Victor could see the guilt and fear in her posture. This was their last moment together, before everything fell apart. Victor studied each face, memorizing them. These weren't abstract historical figures anymore. They were real women who'd loved each other, worked together, and been torn apart by circumstances and choices. He placed the photograph next to the one from 1955, before and after. The same women, but everything changed between those two moments. When Anna Kovac arrived with her family the following week, Victor had the shelter arranged like a memorial. Candles lit the space. The journals were displayed on the table. The forged identity papers were there, along with the medical log, the supply manifests, all the evidence of what had happened here. Anna descended the stairs slowly, her adult children supporting her. At the bottom, she stopped and stood in silence for a long moment. Then she knelt on the stone floor and pressed her hands to the ground. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for our lives. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for everything." Her children wept. Her grandchildren, young adults who'd driven up from Toronto, stood with tears streaming down their faces as their grandmother told them the story of being 7 years old and terrified, of being given soup and safety by women who owed her nothing but gave her everything. Victor showed them Sister Agnes's journal entry about their family. "The Kovac children are precious and brave." Little Anna asked me today if God was angry at her family. I told her God loves the truth-tellers, even when the world doesn't. She smiled for the first time since they arrived. Anna read it 3 times, her fingers trembling on the page. She told me that. I remember. I asked her if God was angry, and she said exactly those words. Anna looked up at Victor. "I've carried that with me for 67 years. God loves the truth-tellers. It's why I became a journalist. It's why I raised my children to speak up for what's right." Victor understood it then, fully understood what the nuns had created. Not just saved lives, but shaped them. Every person who passed through this shelter carried forward the courage they'd witnessed. They became truth-tellers, helpers, people who chose mercy over safety. The ripples extended through generations. That night, after Anna and her family left, Victor sat alone in the shelter and finally allowed himself to cry. For the nuns, for the refugees, for all the courage and sacrifice and love that had been buried here for decades, and for himself, for the purposeless man who'd stumbled into this story and found his own redemption in honoring theirs. Victor found the letter on a cold morning in late November, 3 months after he'd first discovered the shelter. He'd been reorganizing the filing cabinets, creating a proper archive system with Eugene's help. The letter was wedged behind the bottom drawer of the last cabinet, sealed in a waterproof envelope and taped to the back panel, where it would only be found by someone doing exactly what Victor was doing, taking everything apart. The envelope was marked in urgent handwriting. "To whoever finds this place, the truth must be known." Victor's hands shook as he opened it. Inside were 3 pages, written in a different hand than Sister Agnes's careful script. The writing was hurried, almost frantic in places, but still legible. February 10th, 1962. My name is Sister Margaret. If you are reading this, you have discovered what we tried to preserve. You deserve to know the whole truth, including the parts Sister Agnes would be too kind to tell. Victor sat down at the table, his heart pounding, and began to read. We were 9 sisters who chose to follow conscience over obedience. For 6 years we harbored refugees, saved lives, and broke every rule we'd sworn to uphold. We did this work together, bound by faith and purpose. But we were not perfect. We were human, and humans fail each other in terrible ways. The woman whose face you will find scratched from our photograph is Sister Florence. She was my friend. She was our sister, and she destroyed everything we built. Florence joined our order in 1953, 3 years before we began the shelter work. She was young, earnest, deeply devoted to the church hierarchy. When Sister Agnes first proposed hiding refugees, Florence was uncertain but willing. She participated in the early days, helped prepare the shelter, even assisted with forging documents. But as the years passed, Florence grew afraid. The danger became real to her in ways it hadn't before. Government raids increased. Father K warned us of closer scrutiny. Florence began to question whether we had the right to take such risks. In December 1961, Florence went to the bishop. She confessed everything. She believed she was protecting the church from scandal, protecting us from ourselves. The bishop was horrified. He ordered us to stop immediately, threatened excommunication if we continued. Sister Agnes refused. We had 3 families in the shelter at that moment. We could not abandon them. The bishop gave us until February to evacuate everyone and seal the operation. But Florence didn't stop there. On January 28, 1962, Florence contacted government authorities. She told them the convent was harboring enemies of the state. She gave them names, dates, details. She thought she was doing the right thing. She thought these people were dangerous criminals, not refugees. She genuinely believed she was serving both church and country. Father K got word to us. We had 3 days before the raid. 3 days to evacuate everyone, destroy records, hide evidence. We worked day and night. The last family left on February 13th. We bricked up the entrance on February 14th. The authorities arrived on February 15th. They found nothing. An empty convent, 9 nuns, no evidence of wrongdoing. But the church knew the truth. Within a week, we were separated, sent to different convents across the country, forbidden from contacting each other, ordered to never speak of what we'd done. Sister Florence was sent to an isolated convent in the mountains as punishment. The church blamed her for the scandal, even though she'd acted out of loyalty to them. She died there in 1963, alone and shunned by the very institution she'd tried to protect. I do not hate Florence. I pity her. She was paralyzed by fear and blind devotion. She could not see that the rules she was protecting were wrong. She could not imagine that sometimes obedience to God requires disobedience to men. But here is what you must understand. Sister Agnes saw this coming. Weeks before Florence's betrayal, Agnes knew something would end our work. She kept one complete record of everything we'd done. Every name, every date, every detail. She told me she would hide it somewhere in the convent, somewhere meaningful. If anyone ever finds the shelter, Agnes said, they need to understand the full truth. Not just what we did, but why we did it. Not just the people we saved, but the cost we paid. Agnes believed our story mattered. She believed the courage of those we saved deserved to be remembered. She believed that even though we failed in the end, even though we were scattered and silenced, what we did was worth preserving. She told me where she would hide the record. Her exact words, where we knelt in prayer, beneath the mother's gaze, the truth remains. If you have found the shelter, I beg you to find that record too. Tell the world what happened here. Honor the people we saved. Remember the courage of ordinary women who chose mercy over safety. And if possible, forgive Sister Florence. She was ours, even in her failure. She deserves to be remembered too, not as a villain, but as a woman who could not overcome her fear. May God bless you for finding us. May God give you the courage to tell our story. Sister Margaret, February 10th, 1962. Victor finished reading and sat in stunned silence. The letter changed everything he thought he understood. Sister Florence hadn't just questioned the mission. She'd actively betrayed it. She'd contacted the authorities, put everyone at risk, destroyed 6 years of work. And yet Sister Margaret asked for forgiveness. Victor climbed the stairs, emerging into the chapel. He looked at the statue of Mary, her serene face, her outstretched hands. Where we knelt in prayer, beneath the mother's gaze. He'd been so focused on the shelter itself that he hadn't fully explored the statue. Now he examined it with new urgency. The statue stood on a stone pedestal, integrated into the alcove. He knocked on the pedestal, hollow. His pulse quickened. He called Gus and Harold, who'd become regular fixtures at the convent. Together they studied the statue, looking for a way to access the pedestal without damaging anything. There, Harold pointed. Those aren't decorative. Those are bolts. Hidden beneath decades of paint and grime were 4 bolts holding the statue to the pedestal. Using careful leverage and engineering principles Victor had learned over 40 years, they slowly tilted the heavy marble statue, supporting it with wooden braces. Beneath the pedestal was a hollow space, and inside that space, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, was a metal container. Victor's hands trembled as he lifted it out. The seal cracked as he opened it. Inside was a leather portfolio, its cover embossed with simple words: Complete Record of the Mercy Mission, 1956 or 1962. Sister Agnes's handwriting covered the first page. To whoever finds this, you have discovered what we preserved at great cost. Within these pages is the full accounting of our work. Not just numbers and names, but stories. Real people, real lives, real courage. We were not heroes. We were women who saw suffering and could not look away. We were women who believed faith without action is empty. We broke our vows of obedience because we held a higher vow, to love our neighbors as ourselves. We saved 63 people, 63 lives that might have been lost, 63 futures that would not have existed without this shelter. But we also failed. We could not save everyone. We turned away families when the shelter was full. We watched people leave our gates, knowing we should have done more. Those faces haunt me still. Sister Florence betrayed us, yes, but I do not blame her. She was afraid, and fear is a powerful thing. She believed she was doing right. In her mind, she was saving us from ourselves. I hope she found peace before she died. I hope God was kinder to her than we were. My sisters and I will scatter like seeds on the wind. We will never work together again. We will never speak of these years. But we will carry this knowledge. We mattered. What we did mattered. The people we saved will have children, grandchildren, lives that ripple forward through time. That has to be enough. If you are reading this, please remember us. Tell our story. Honor the courage of those who trusted us with their lives. And remember, ordinary people can change the world. We did. You can too. Sister Agnes, February 12th, 1962. Victor closed the portfolio, tears streaming down his face. Gus stood with his hand over his mouth, weeping silently. Harold had his arm around Gus, both men overwhelmed. 63 people, Victor whispered. They saved 63 people. Inside the portfolio were photographs, letters from refugees after they'd reached safety, detailed accounts of each person who'd passed through the shelter. The Kovacs children had both become doctors. A saved journalist had documented government corruption that led to reforms. A teacher had educated thousands. Each life saved had created ripples, generations of impact, spreading forward through time. Victor had bought this building for $3, looking for a quiet place to disappear. Instead, he'd found a story that demanded to be told, a legacy that refused to stay buried. Sister Agnes had hidden the truth where faith and courage met. Now Victor understood his purpose, to bring that truth into the light, to honor the women who'd risked everything, to make sure their courage was never forgotten. The betrayal, the sacrifice, the triumph, the cost, all of it needed to be remembered. All of it mattered. The discovery of Sister Agnes's complete record transformed everything. Victor no longer saw himself as simply restoring a building or preserving history. He was executing a mission, fulfilling a promise made across 63 years. He spent 3 days reading every page of the portfolio. Each entry was a complete story. Names, photographs, circumstances of arrival, details of their time in the shelter, and where they went afterward. Sister Agnes had documented everything with archivist's precision and a storyteller's heart. The Zimmerman family arrived exhausted and sick, stayed 6 weeks while Sister Catherine treated the wife's pneumonia, left with forged papers and hope. The Kovac family, political dissidents, arrived with 2 terrified children, stayed 3 months while Sister Beatrice created their new identities, departed as the merchant family. A journalist named Henrik Strand, hunted for exposing government corruption, sheltered for 2 weeks, given documents that allowed him to reach Sweden, where he continued his truth-telling work. A teacher, Maria Castellano, fired for teaching banned books, hidden for a month, eventually relocated to a school in Canada where she taught for 30 more years. On and on, 63 stories of courage meeting courage, of desperation meeting mercy. But there were also the failures Sister Agnes had referenced. Entries marked with a simple cross. Families they'd had to turn away because the shelter was full. People who'd arrived too sick or injured to save. Refugees who'd disappeared before reaching safety. We cannot save everyone, Sister Agnes had written after one particularly painful loss. But we must save who we can. To do nothing because we cannot do everything is the greatest failure of all. Victor organized a meeting at the convent. Eugene, Iris, Harold, Anna, Kovac, who'd returned from Toronto, and Barbara, the woman born in the shelter. They gathered in the chapel, the portfolio spread before them. "This is more than just historical documentation," Eugene said, his voice reverent. "This is a complete account of a resistance operation. The detail, the preservation, it's extraordinary." "What do we do with it?" Victor asked. Sister Agnes wanted the story told, but how do we honor that without exploiting it? Iris spoke up. "We let the refugees and their descendants tell it, not as a dramatic story, but as a testimony. These are real lives we're talking about." Harold nodded. "I've been in contact with other descendants through Phyllis's research. There are at least 20 families we've located so far. They all want their stories told. They want to honor the nuns who saved their grandparents." "We could create a memorial exhibit," Anna suggested. "Something permanent, not just in a museum, but here, in this place where it happened." "The convent could become a memorial site," Eugene added, warming to the idea. "We preserve the shelter exactly as it was, create an exhibition space in the upper floors, tell the complete story." Victor listened as plans formed, as these people who'd been strangers months ago became collaborators in something larger than any of them. But something still bothered him. "What about Sister Florence?" he asked quietly. "Do we tell that part too?" The room fell silent. Finally Anna spoke, her voice gentle. "My parents taught me that truth matters, even when it's complicated, especially when it's complicated. Sister Florence was part of this story. Leaving her out would be dishonest. She betrayed them," Barbara said. "She destroyed what they built." "She was also terrified and believed she was doing right," Victor countered, remembering Sister Margaret's letter. "Sister Margaret asked us to forgive her, to remember her not as a villain, but as someone who couldn't overcome her fear." Harold leaned forward. My grandfather used to say that the hardest thing about being human is that we're all capable of both courage and cowardice, sometimes in the same day. Maybe Sister Florence's story is important precisely because it shows that. They decided together. They would tell the full truth, the courage and the fear, the triumph and the betrayal, the lives saved and the cost paid. All of it mattered. Over the following weeks, Victor threw himself into preparing for what they were calling the memorial gathering. They set a date 3 months out, March 15th, the anniversary of when the first refugee family had arrived in 1956. Phyllis located more descendants, a woman whose grandfather had been a union organizer, a man whose aunt had been a political activist, children and grandchildren of teachers, journalists, laborers, dreamers, all saved by 9 nuns in a hidden shelter. Victor commissioned a memorial plaque for the chapel. The inscription took him days to write, revising and refining until it captured what needed to be said. In memory of 9 women who risked everything to save lives. 1956-1962. Sisters Agnes, Catherine, Beatrice, Teresa, Dorothy, Margaret, Ruth, Florence, and name lost to time. They believed faith required action. They chose mercy over safety. They saved 63 souls. Including Florence's name in the memorial was controversial. Eugene questioned it. Some of the descendants balked, but Victor insisted, remembering Sister Margaret's plea for forgiveness. She was theirs, he told the group. She failed them, but she was theirs, and they asked us to remember her too. Meanwhile, Victor made a decision about Sister Beatrice. Phyllis had located her, the only surviving member of the original 9 nuns, age 94, in a nursing home 3 hours north. Victor needed to meet her. He made the drive on a grey February morning, Iris accompanying him. Sacred Heart. Assisted living was a quiet place, well-maintained, but institutional. They found Sister Beatrice in the common room, a tiny woman in a wheelchair, wrapped in blankets despite the warmth. When Victor introduced himself and explained why he'd come, Sister Beatrice's eyes, still sharp despite her age, filled with tears. "I thought no one would ever know," she whispered, her voice thin as paper. "I thought we'd be forgotten forever." Victor pulled up a chair beside her wheelchair. "Sister Beatrice, I found the shelter. I found the journals, the medical logs, the forged documents. I found Sister Agnes's complete record." The old nun's hands flew to her mouth. "Agnes kept her promise. She said she would preserve our story, but I never knew if anyone would find it." "Tell me about her," Victor said gently. "Tell me about all of them." For the next 2 hours, Sister Beatrice shared memories that no written record could capture. Sister Agnes's quiet strength and private doubts, Sister Catherine's healing hands, and her weeping after losing a patient. Sister Dorothy's terrible cooking that they all pretended to love. Sister Teresa's beautiful singing voice that comforted frightened children. And Sister Florence. "She was scared," Beatrice said softly. "She joined our order because she wanted certainty, wanted to be told what was right and wrong. The shelter work terrified her because there was no certainty, only choices with terrible consequences. She thought turning us in would protect the church. She thought she was being faithful." "Do you forgive her?" Iris asked gently. Beatrice was quiet for a long moment. "I wrote to her, you know, before she died. Told her I understood. Told her she was forgiven. She never wrote back. I think the guilt destroyed her." Tears rolled down the old woman's wrinkled cheeks. "Yes, I forgive her. She was my sister. You don't stop loving your family just because they fail you." Victor showed her photographs from the portfolio, Pictures of families they'd saved, letters from refugees who'd written to thank them, the children who'd grown into adults with families of their own. Beatrice wept openly, touching the photographs with trembling fingers. We saved them. We actually saved them. You saved 63 people, Victor said, and I'm planning a memorial gathering to honor what you all did. Will you come? Will you see the shelter one more time? The old nun looked at him with sudden, fierce determination. I'll come. Even if it kills me, I'll come. I need to see it again. I need to stand where we stood and remember what we did. As they prepared to leave, Sister Beatrice gripped Victor's hand with surprising strength. Thank you, she said. Thank you for caring. Thank you for finding us. Thank you for making sure we mattered. You did matter, Victor said, his voice thick with emotion. You changed the world. On the drive back, Iris was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, Dad, I'm proud of you. You found something broken and made it whole again. Not just the building, the story, the memory, the legacy. You did that. Victor thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago, lost, purposeless, hiding from life in a sleeping bag in his truck. Then he thought about who he was becoming, someone who preserved truth, honored courage, connected past to present. I didn't do it alone, he said. The nuns did the hard part. I'm just making sure people remember. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't quite true. Remembering was hard work, too. Bearing witness, telling difficult truths, refusing to let courage be forgotten. All of that required its own kind of bravery. The nuns had chosen mercy over safety. Victor was choosing memory over comfort. Both choices came with a cost. Both choices mattered. As they drove through the late afternoon light, Victor felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt ready. Ready for whatever came next. Ready to honor the promise he'd made to women he'd never met, but knew better than almost anyone alive. The memorial gathering was 2 months away. 2 months to prepare, to organize, to bring together everyone whose lives had been touched by what happened in that hidden shelter. 2 months to make sure Sister Agnes's final wish came true, that ordinary people would remember and be inspired to know they too could change the world. The morning of the memorial gathering, Victor woke early in the restored convent. Over the past month, with help from Gus and volunteers from the community, they'd made the building presentable. The roof was sound, windows repaired, heat restored to the main floors. It wasn't finished, but it was whole enough to welcome guests. In the chapel, Sister Beatrice's personal Bible rested on a small table near the altar. Victor had found it tucked inside the portfolio, its leather cover worn soft from decades of handling. The margins were filled with handwritten notes spanning 40 years, prayers, questions, reflections that revealed a woman wrestling with faith while living it fully. An early entry from 1920, when Agnes was a young nun. Today I took my vows. I promised to serve God with my whole heart. An entry from 1956, the year the shelter began. Does God require permission from men to do his work? I think not. But I am afraid. Victor had read every margin note, watched Agnes's faith deepen and complicate over the years. She'd questioned everything while holding fast to what mattered most: love, mercy, justice. By 10 o'clock, people began arriving. Harold and his family, Anna Kovacs with 3 generations of descendants, Barbara and her children, Phyllis the genealogy researcher, Eugene with colleagues from the university, local historical society members, Gus and his extended family, and others, descendants Victor had never met before. A man whose grandmother had been a teacher saved by the nuns, a woman whose grandfather had been a journalist. They came with photographs, Letters, stories passed down through families, fragments of memory that had waited decades to find context. Preston arrived just before 11, standing awkwardly near the entrance. Victor saw him and felt his chest tighten. They hadn't spoken since their argument in the shelter months ago. Iris went to her brother, spoke quietly, then brought him over to Victor. "Dad," Preston said stiffly. "I came because Iris said it was important." "Thank you for coming," Victor said simply. He wanted to say more, but this wasn't the time. At 11:30, a van arrived from Sacred Heart Assisted Living. Victor watched as attendants carefully helped Sister Beatrice into a wheelchair. The old nun looked frailer than she had a month ago, but her eyes were bright with determination. Victor went to greet her. "Sister Beatrice, welcome home." She reached up and took his hand. "Take me to the shelter first, please. Before the ceremony, I need to see it alone." Victor looked at the attendants, who nodded. He wheeled her through the chapel to the opening behind the altar, no longer bricked up, but fitted with a proper door and a ramp for accessibility. Down they went, slowly, carefully. At the bottom, Victor turned on the lights they'd installed. The shelter looked exactly as it had when he'd first discovered it, but cleaner, organized, preserved. Sister Beatrice sat in silence for several minutes, her gaze moving slowly around the room. She looked at the medical supplies on shelves, the filing cabinets, the table where the nuns had planned their dangerous work. "We were so young," she finally said. "I was 32 when we started. Agnes was 46. We thought we knew what we were doing." She laughed softly, a sound like dry leaves. "We had no idea." "You saved 63 people," Victor said gently. "We saved who we could." She pointed to a corner of the room. "There. That's where we kept the children when families came. We'd set up a little area with blankets, a few toys. Sister Dorothy would tell them stories." Her eyes filled with tears. "I remember their faces. All of them. Every single child who passed through here." Victor knelt beside the wheelchair. "Sister Beatrice, I found a letter Sister Agnes wrote. She said your story mattered." She was right. The old nun looked at him with ancient eyes. "We were ordinary women who saw suffering and couldn't look away. That's all. Anyone could have done what we did. But most people didn't. You did." Beatrice reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out an envelope. "Before Sister Agnes died, she wrote me one final letter. I've kept it for 47 years. I'd like you to read it at the ceremony. Her voice should be there today." Victor took the envelope carefully. Through the paper, he could feel the weight of words waiting to be heard. They returned upstairs to find over 200 people gathered in and around the chapel. The local news had sent a reporter. The crowd had spilled out into the hallway and entrance area. Victor had prepared brief remarks, but looking at all these faces, descendants of the saved, community members, historians, people who'd simply heard the story and come to bear witness, he realized his words were inadequate. He wheeled Sister Beatrice to the front, beside the memorial plaque they'd installed on the wall. The brass gleamed in the afternoon light, filtering through the restored stained glass. Eugene spoke first, providing historical context. Harold shared his grandparents' story. Anna Kovac described being 7 years old and terrified, being given soup and safety by women who owed her nothing. Then Victor stepped forward, holding the envelope Sister Beatrice had given him. His hands shook slightly as he opened it and began to read. "My dear Beatrice," Sister Agnes had written in 1975, 3 years before her death. "I am an old woman now, far from the sisters I loved, far from the work that defined me. Some days I wonder if what we did mattered. The world is still full of suffering. People still flee persecution. Courage is still rare and costly. But then I remember the children, the families, the hope in their eyes when they realized they were safe. I remember you, Catherine, Dorothy, all of you, your bravery, your kindness, your willingness to risk everything for people you didn't know. And I think, yes, we mattered. Every life we saved mattered. Every act of mercy matters, even when the world forgets. Beatrice, if you ever read this, know that I loved you all. Our sisterhood was not defined by proximity, but by purpose. We were brave together. And what we did, imperfect, incomplete, but real, that was worth everything we paid. I hope you remembered we mattered. I hope you forgave Florence. I hope you lived with peace. All my love, Agnes. Victor's voice broke on the final words. The chapel was utterly silent. Sister Beatrice sat with tears streaming down her face, nodding slowly. I did, Agnes, she whispered. I remembered. After Victor finished reading Sister Agnes's letter, Sister Beatrice asked to speak. An attendant brought a microphone to her wheelchair, and the old nun's thin voice carried through the chapel. I want to tell you about the last day, she said. February 14th, 1962, the day we sealed the shelter and said goodbye to each other. The crowd leaned forward, silent and attentive. We'd spent 3 days evacuating everyone, destroying most of our records, preparing to scatter. Father Kay had warned us the authorities were coming. We knew we'd never work together again. We knew the church would punish us. But we also knew we'd done what we had to do. That last morning, we gathered in the shelter one final time. All 9 of us. Even Florence. Sister Beatrice paused, her weathered hands gripping the arms of her wheelchair. Florence was destroyed by what she'd done. She kept saying she was sorry, that she'd been trying to protect us. Sister Agnes took her hands and said, I know you were afraid. I forgive you. Then Agnes made us all join hands in a circle and she prayed. She thanked God for giving us 6 years of purpose. She asked him to protect the people we'd saved. And she asked him to forgive Florence and to help us forgive her too. Then we bricked up the entrance. We cried as we worked. We were sealing away 6 years of our lives, the most meaningful work any of us would ever do. When it was done, we held each other. We promised we'd never forget. And then church officials arrived and separated us. I never saw most of them again. The old nun's voice wavered, but she continued. Sister Agnes died in Oregon in 1978. Sister Catherine died in 1985. Sister Dorothy in 1991. The others, I don't know when they passed. We weren't allowed to stay in touch. Sister Florence died in 1963, barely a year after we separated. She was 34 years old. I think the guilt killed her. Sister Beatrice looked around the chapel at the faces watching her. I carried this secret for 63 years. I thought it would die with me. I thought no one would ever know what we did, what we risked, what we lost. But Mr. Lane found us. He cared enough to dig through rubble and read old journals and piece together a story everyone else had forgotten. She turned her gaze to Victor, and he felt the weight of it. Gratitude, blessing, recognition. You gave us back our meaning, she said simply. Thank you. The ceremony continued. More descendants shared stories. Eugene unveiled plans for a permanent exhibition. The Historical Society announced the convent would be preserved as a memorial site. But for Victor, the moment that mattered most came afterward, during the reception in the restored entrance hall. Preston approached him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Victor without a word, and they stood together in awkward silence. I was wrong, Preston finally said, about all of this. I thought you were running away from your life. I didn't understand you were running toward something." Victor felt emotion tighten his throat. I couldn't explain it in a way that made sense. I barely understood it myself. I saw your face when you were reading that letter. When Sister Beatrice was speaking, you looked... Preston searched for words. You looked like you mattered. Like what you were doing mattered. It does matter. I know that now. Preston stared into his coffee cup. I've been angry at you for a long time. About the divorce. About everything. I blamed you for our family falling apart. But watching you today, seeing what you've built here, I realized something. You didn't fall apart, Dad. You fell down, and then you got back up. That's different. Victor set down his coffee and pulled his son into an embrace. Preston stiffened for a moment, then hugged back, and both men stood there holding each other while the reception flowed around them. "Can I bring the kids to see this place?" Preston asked when they separated, wiping his eyes. "I want them to know their grandfather did something important." "I'd like that," Victor said. "I'd like that very much." Later, as the crowd thinned, Victor found himself standing in the shelter with Sister Beatrice one last time. The old nun had asked to be brought down again before she left. She touched the walls, the table, the shelves. Then she turned to Victor. "This is the last time I'll be here," she said. "I'm 94 years old. I won't see this place again." "You've given people back their history," Victor said. "That's a gift." "No," Beatrice said firmly. "You did that. You're the one who refused to let us be forgotten." She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a wooden rosary, hand-carved, worn smooth from decades of use. "This was Sister Agnes's," she said. "I've kept it since she died. I want you to have it. Hang it in the chapel, where you found the other one. Let people see it, and remember that faith requires action." Victor took the rosary, feeling its weight in his palm. The same hands that had carved documents to save lives had carved these beads. "I'll take care of it," he promised. "I know you will." Sister Beatrice looked around the shelter one last time. "We did good work here. Imperfect, incomplete, but good. And now, because of you, people will remember." She reached up and patted Victor's cheek with a weathered hand. "You saved us too, you know. You saved our story. That's its own kind of mercy." As the attendants helped Sister Beatrice back upstairs, Victor stood alone in the shelter. He thought about the journey that had brought him here. The divorce, the auction, the $3, the bricked-up doorway. He'd been looking for a place to disappear. Instead, he'd found a reason to be remembered. Not for his own sake, but as the keeper of someone else's courage, as the guardian of a story that deserved to live. That was enough. That was everything. 6 months after the memorial gathering, spring came to the convent with renewed purpose. Victor stood on the front steps, watching as a group of school children climbed off a bus for an educational tour. The convent had become what they'd envisioned, a living memorial, a place where history breathed and courage spoke across generations. The building was fully restored now. The upper floors housed a permanent exhibition documenting the Mercy Mission, as they'd come to call it. Sister Agnes's journals were displayed in climate-controlled cases. Photographs of the 63 saved refugees lined the walls, each with their story told in careful detail. The shelter remained exactly as it had been found, preserved as sacred ground. Gus had officially retired from handyman work, but came by 3 times a week to lead tours. He'd finally opened up about his grandmother, sharing her story with visitors, how she'd worked in the convent kitchen, how she'd known what the nuns were doing and kept their secret, how she'd carried that knowledge with silent pride until her death. My grandmother was part of it too, Gus would tell tour groups. Not a nun, just a woman who cooked meals. But she fed refugees when they were hungry. She kept their secret when discovery meant death. Courage comes in all forms. Victor had hired a small staff, a curator, an educator, 2 part-time guides. The Historical Society had secured grants for ongoing preservation. Eugene's book about the Mercy Mission would be published in the fall, and a documentary filmmaker was editing footage for a feature-length film. But for Victor, the most meaningful change was personal. Preston brought his children every month now. Victor's grandchildren, 8-year-old Sophie and 5-year-old Marcus, ran through the halls with the kind of joy that made the building feel alive again. They loved the shelter especially, asking endless questions about the brave nuns and the families they'd saved. "Grandpa," Sophie had asked on their last visit, "were you scared when you found the secret room?" "A little," Victor admitted. "But mostly I was curious. Sometimes the most important things are hidden, waiting for someone brave enough to look." Iris had taken a sabbatical from teaching to work at the convent full-time, developing educational programming. Father and daughter worked side by side, their relationship deeper than it had ever been. Even Diane, his ex-wife, had visited. She'd called a few weeks after the memorial ceremony, her voice careful. "I saw the news coverage," she'd said. "Preston told me what you've been doing. I'm proud of you, Victor. You sound like yourself again." They'd met for coffee, the first time they'd spoken face to face since the divorce was finalized. It wasn't a reconciliation. Too much had broken between them. But it was peace. Recognition that they'd both been lost for a while, and both had found their way to different shores. "You needed this," Diane had said, gesturing to the photos Victor had shown her. "I never understood that. I thought you needed stability, routine, safety. But you needed purpose." "I didn't know that until I found it," Victor replied. Sister Beatrice had died peacefully in her sleep, 2 months after the memorial gathering. She'd lived long enough to see the exhibit opening, to know the story would be preserved. Victor had been with her the day before she died, reading her passages from Eugene's manuscript. "It's beautiful," she'd whispered. "Agnes would be so pleased." At her funeral, Victor had met 2 other elderly nuns who'd known Beatrice in her later years. They'd shared stories about how Beatrice spoke of her sisters with love and longing, how she'd kept faith despite the separation, how she'd forgiven Florence and prayed for her soul until the day she died. She never stopped believing their work mattered, one nun told Victor. "You proved her right." Now on this spring morning, Victor walked through the chapel to hang Sister Agnes's rosary beside the first one he'd found. 2 rosaries, 2 women of faith, one story of courage that refused to be forgotten. He'd started keeping his own journal, documenting the convent's transformation and his own. The entries were simple, reflective, honest. March 20th. Today I realized I'm happy. Not distracted, not temporarily content, actually happy. I wake up with purpose. I go to bed satisfied. This building that cost me $3 has given me back my life. April 15th. Preston asked me to teach Sophie and Marcus about construction, to show them how buildings work. We spent the afternoon looking at beams and foundations. Preston said, "I want them to learn from you, Dad. You know how to see what's broken and make it whole." I cried after they left. May 2nd. A woman visited today whose grandmother was saved by the nuns. She brought a letter her grandmother wrote but never sent, a thank you to Sister Agnes that lived in a drawer for 50 years. We added it to the collection. Every week, someone new comes forward with a piece of the story. It's like the past is healing itself, one memory at a time. Victor closed his journal and walked outside. The grounds were being landscaped by volunteers, flowers planted where weeds had grown, paths cleared where ivy had claimed everything. Lloyd Mackey, the auction coordinator, stopped by occasionally to see what had become of the $3 Convent. He'd shaken his head in wonder at the transformation. "You saw something the rest of us missed," Lloyd had said. "No," Victor corrected. "The nuns saw something. I just made sure other people could see it too." That evening, Victor sat on the front steps as the sun set, painting the Gothic spires in gold and amber light. He thought about the man he'd been a year ago, broken, purposeless, invisible to himself. He thought about Sister Agnes, writing by candlelight in an underground shelter, documenting courage because she believed it mattered. He thought about the 63 people whose lives had been saved and the generations that had followed: doctors, teachers, artists, parents, dreamers, all because 9 women chose mercy over safety. Victor pulled out his phone and recorded a message for the memorial website, something visitors could hear when they toured the convent. "My name is Victor Lane. I bought this building for $3 at a county auction. I thought I was buying a place to hide. Instead, I found a story that demanded to be told. The women who lived here believed that ordinary people can change the world. They proved it by saving 63 lives. And they changed mine too, 63 years after they sealed this place and walked away. If you're visiting this memorial, remember, you don't have to be extraordinary to do extraordinary things. You just have to care enough to try. The nuns cared. I'm trying to care the same way. I hope their story inspires you to do the same." He saved the recording and looked up at the convent, no longer forgotten, no longer cursed, no longer empty. A place of memory, a place of courage, a place of redemption. Home.